Okay, I think everybody's muted. Um, my name is Melanie Moon, and I want to thank the Anderson Township Senior Center for inviting me to present Race in the City, Work Community and Protest in Cincinnati, 1820 to 1970. Thank you so much for having me and my chapter champions to share the book with you. Well, about myself, I'm Cincinnati born and bred. I'm a retired librarian currently. I am a fitness instructor, and I try to give people some tips about diet and exercise, few wellness tips every now and then. I am the mother of 4 grown children and the grandmother of 4 grandchildren, of whom I'm proud of all of them. To tell you a little bit about how I found this book, I came across this book while researching for the housing work team as we were working on the Evanston 10-year plan, the 10-year plan. I was searching for something and this book came up and I started to read it and it just floored me. So I will again tell you the title of the book. It is Race and the City, Work Community and Protest in Cincinnati, 1820 to 1970. It is a compilation of essays. It's not an easy read, it's an academic read. And one of the contributors, also the editor, Dr. Henry Lewis Taylor Jr., he wrote or co-wrote, I think, about 3 of the essays. So if you'll go ahead and show my graph, Les, I'll get into that. When I saw this graph that's going to be shown for you, it was quite obvious to me that ADOS, A-D-O-S, that stands for American Descendants of Slavery. There's the graph. Hopefully you can all see it. That we are in a catastrophic situation and it's not improving. The only thing that will improve the situation for ADOS is reparations. So hopefully you can understand the graph. This is the share of net worth of all US households. The 90th percent, that green line represents the white population. The Black population is represented with the yellow line, which is a little difficult to see, and that's primarily who I'm talking about. Then you've got your Latino population there, the red line, and all others are blue. So that's what that graph represents, that 90% of the wealth in our country is held by white families. And the rest of the wealth is held by the rest of us. But the one thing that stands out, another thing that stands out, I should say, about this graph is that Blacks, African Americans, are right there with Latinos. And they only started immigrating to the United States in the late, I think it was 1980s, in the 1980s. Whereas African Americans have been in this country for over 400 years. And we're on the same plane. And the line is really not true because it doesn't tell you that the Blacks are not all ADOS, not all African Americans. Some in there are Blacks from different countries who brought wealth with them to the United States. So there you've got your wealth. And when it comes to the yellow line representing African Americans, there are other Blacks in that line. And the other thing that might give that line, the yellow line representing African Americans, a little boost would be Michael Jordan, Oprah Winfrey, Jay-Z, Beyonce, okay? So they're helping to boost that line. For the most part, African Americans hold approximately $1,700 in household wealth. when you don't include the car. So needless to say, this is a dire situation. So the book, Race in the City, as I was reading, I found that it explains in data-driven detail why Cincinnati Blacks have no wealth. It's all in this book. So we will be presenting, you can take that chart down, thank you. We will be presenting in chapter order. So first to present will be Laurie, and each of the chapter champions will give an introduction of themselves. I'm going to fill in for chapters 3, 4, and 6, but the other chapter champions will be handling their chapters. So you've got Laurie, there you are.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laurie Roche. I've been a friend of Melanie's for several years, and I met her 3 years ago, shortly after I retired. I'm a member of Bellarmine Chapel, Catholic Church on the Xavier University campus, and we had a community gardening project in Evanston, and I met Melanie through that and became involved in her Race in the City project. So I'm doing chapter 1, as she said, and until I read this chapter, or I read the book, I did not realize that Cincinnati holds such an important place and distinctive place in the history of African struggle in the country. And the book opens with a statement that I think is a good overview that I'd like to read to you, a brief paragraph. It says, Cincinnati is a border city in a border state, and it sits astride the boundary between North and South. Cincinnati was a real dividing line between slavery and freedom. In the antebellum era, which is before the Civil War, the population was composed of large numbers of Southerners, including Black population consisting primarily of former slaves and aggressive abolitionists. So Cincinnati was, and some people might argue that it still is, a city of paradox, having a sort of a dual personality in a single urban area. Also, what attracted the essayists and Henry Louis Taylor to this, after World War II, Cincinnati emerged as a national leader in city planning and housing reform. So the scholars who wrote the essays in this book wanted to know whether Cincinnati's abolitionist efforts, as well as its housing reform efforts, if those two things made life any better for its Black residents. And the conclusion from the book is that whatever gains Cincinnati's Black residents have made over the decades are in fact largely the result not of these reforms, but of their own struggle against an unrelenting burden of obstacles. As Melanie said in her introduction, the chapters in Race in the City cover a period of 140 years from 1820, well before the Civil War, to 1970. And in the opening section, we learn about our shamelessly racist early days. I give you an example. As soon as it became a state, Ohio enacted a series of codes, which came to be known as the Black Laws. And these laws were to discourage Black immigration from the South. Conservative white Southerners settling in Cincinnati reinforced these codes with many other discriminatory practices. And these practices were all designed to deprive Black people of housing, of education, of jobs, and of every other opportunity. So this gives you the foundation, the beginnings of the wealth gap that Melanie first described. At the same time, and this goes to that paradox I was talking about, Northerners and liberal-minded Southerners did move to Cincinnati, since we were a border city, and turned it into a hotbed of abolitionism and a major station on the Underground Railroad. Lester, if you want to just, he's going to put up, share his screen here, a photo. This is from the website of the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, which I encourage you to visit. They are open even during COVID. This is the house. It's located in Walnut Hills. And one of the reasons for Cincinnati's abolitionist leanings was Harriet Beecher Stowe herself, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Her father, Lyman Beecher, who was a pastor, and her husband, Calvin Stowe, all were very much involved in anti-slavery activities. You can take that down, but you can go there. It's a wonderful place. Melanie and I presented there. Again, in chapter 1 of Race in the City, we read of how Cincinnati's Black residents formed their own culture, and they fought constantly to control their own destiny. And we learn how racism, not human deficits, as a lot of whites were taught to believe, were what created the obstacles faced by Cincinnati's African-American residents. Chapter 1 continues on through the rise of the industrial metropolis in the decades following the Civil War, and then the post-industrial city with urban and social change and protest, and all of this is expanded in the other essays in the book. We learn about Black leaders who worked so hard to change and overcome all the distorted systems and structures. These systems made race and class, not merit, effort, or inherent human dignity, the determinants of life opportunity for African Americans. These systems defined our past, and in many ways, they define where we are today. Maybe some of you have seen the movie Just Mercy or read the book. I've done both, and I've also been to Montgomery, Alabama to see the what so-called lynching memorial and the works of the Equal Justice Initiative. And Brian Stephen, the man behind all of these things, wrote something that I want to share with you as I begin to close. He said, "We passed the 13th Amendment that prohibits involuntary servitude and forced labor, but it doesn't say anything about ending this narrative of racial difference. And because of that, I don't think slavery ended in 1865. I think it evolved." Race in the City, the book, helps us to understand how that evolution played out in our own city. It's my passionate belief that all of us, but especially those of us who are white, have what I would call a sacred duty to learn the truth about our country's history and how that history shapes where we are today. That's why I'm doing this. That's why I've tried to help Melanie in my small way. It's not what we learned in school or heard about in our homes. It's a very hard truth to own and understand, and I do think our big country is beginning to do this, that our nation was built, and as white people, our own place in that nation was secured at the expense of the Native people and at the expense of the people who were brought here to be enslaved. Several years ago, I began my own journey across what we call the color line, and I believe it's a journey that will last the rest of my life. It began with reflection on my childhood and my youth, the community and the society in which I was raised. And this can be very humbling when you realize how oblivious you were to the struggle and suffering going on all around you that was mostly unseen due to segregation. It continues with reading and listening and learning, always with an open mind and an open heart. And there's so many wonderful resources. You may even want to begin here in Cincinnati at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, either with a visit. It is open now in spite of COVID. Lester's going to put up a picture. I really like this picture of this flame at the top of the Freedom Center because it looks across the river to Kentucky and reinforces that idea of what a border city and still somewhat southern facing city Cincinnati is. But the Freedom Center's website and its online learning opportunities are just amazing. And even if you can't go there due to the coronavirus, I encourage you to visit their website. So along this journey that my life has been enriched with new friends like Melanie and new experiences, new opportunities, new purpose. In closing, I would say that I believe if you commit yourself to this journey in whatever way you can, you will eventually be transformed by a hunger for racial justice. We are seeing that growing hunger in our country today, and we need to keep it alive. It's the answer to building a nation that finally lives up to its creeds and its ideals. Thank you.
Do I just jump in now?
Yes, go right ahead.
Okay. My name is Dale Bradford. I am a retired businessman. I was born and raised in Arlington, Virginia, suburbs of Washington, D.C., and I've spent 9 years of my life in Brazil, a country that is in some respects racially blind because almost everybody in Brazil has some black blood in them. And consequently, I've always been sensitive to the situation with black people in the world and in the country. I am going to talk about one individual named John Mercer Langston. This is chapter 2 in the book. Shortly after graduating from Oberlin College, he was elected as clerk of the Brownhelm Township in north central Ohio in 1855, an election that would have been completely unexceptional, except that he was the first African American ever elected to public office in the US. Later, he was the first dean of the law school at Howard University. After serving as the US minister to Haiti for 8 years, he became president of the State College for African Americans in Virginia. In 1888, he was elected to Congress in Virginia. He was the first, and for at least 100 years after, the only African American elected to Congress from Virginia. John's career seems more remarkable in light of his early emotional trauma and social dislocation. He was born as a free man in 1829 on a Virginia plantation. He was the son of Ralph Quarles, a wealthy white slaveholder, and Lucy Jane Langston, a part Native American, part Black emancipated slave. That means a free slave. The deaths in 1834 of both parents left 4-year-old John financially well provided for, but unprotected by Virginia law. He was taken in by the family of William Gooch, white friends of his father, on a farm near Chillicothe, Ohio. He treated like a son and called Johnny Gooch. The light-skinned boy attended a whites-only public school. And then 5 years later, the Gooches were moving to Missouri, and the court said he could not go with them because Missouri was a slave state. And so in 1840, his brother Gideon arranged for him to move to Cincinnati. He was still struggling, John was, with his sense of being abandoned by the only family he knew. And then the court labeled him as Black. He moved to Cincinnati as an 11-year-old boy with no experience in being Black and embarked on life in the Black community of the most race-conscious city in the state of Ohio. Can you imagine, as an 11-year-old boy, learning that you are black after spending your whole life thinking you're white. Cincinnati had become the sixth largest city in the country, and because of its rapid growth, the economy was also flourishing. Due to hard work and frugality, some blacks were also thriving economically, despite horrible racism and laws designed to keep blacks suppressed. One person said, if there ever existed in any colored community in the United States anything like an aristocratic class of such persons, it was found in Cincinnati. By the summer of 1841, whites in Cincinnati were upset with the improvement in the lives of blacks. And on the night of September 3rd, 1841, a white mob in Cincinnati entered a black neighborhood, beating and killing any black person they saw. You would think that the blacks might form a mob and attack white leaders due to the rampant racism. But no, the riot was carried out by whites because they saw blacks starting to progress socially and economically, and the white people wanted that stopped. This riot had a big impact on John Langston, and thank God for people of influence and goodness like John Mercer Langston. Might we do and be the same. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Laurie, and thank you, Dale. I am doing chapter 3. Black Leadership in Antebellum Cincinnati by James Oliver Horton and Stacy Flaherty. So this is talking about the black leaders in Cincinnati before antebellum, before the Civil War. National black leaders, Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, visited Cincinnati from time to time. But black Cincinnatians highly esteemed their local black leaders. A list of 82 black Cincinnatians who were selected to head groups and hold offices in organizations was compiled from primary documents between 1830 and 1860. Despite the issues with which they had to deal on a daily basis, such as discrimination, Ohio's black codes, you've heard about those, purchasing family members that were still in slavery in the South, just to name a few. There were those who rose to take on the burden of helping runaway slaves by making clothes, providing food and shelter. Elizabeth Coleman and Sarah Ernest headed the Anti-Slavery Sewing Society. At the 1849 State Convention of the Colored Citizens of Ohio, Cincinnati delegate Reverend Wallace Shelton spoke against the American Colonization Society funded by Charles McMicken. He said, and this is a quote, "Stay where you are and never leave this land as long as one chain is to be heard clanking or the cry of millions is to be heard floating on every breeze," end quote. He stood firmly on the ground of abolition, urging that blacks be, quote, "willing to work with those whites who advocated freedom, but dismiss those who refused to condemn slaveholding." I had learned of Charles McMicken providing funds to start a school in Cincinnati for white boys and girls, later to be known as, we all know, the University of Cincinnati. But I was not aware of his work with the American Colonization Society, which was established to send freed blacks to West Africa, Liberia, to be specific, until reading this book. Chapter 4, The Black Residential Experience and Community Formation in Antebellum Cincinnati by Henry Louis Taylor Jr. and Vicki Dula. So this chapter is just about how Blacks lived, what they're in their communities, how they formed their communities in pre-Civil War Cincinnati. In Cincinnati today, Blacks can be found in all of our 52 communities. However, we have predominantly Black neighborhoods like Lincoln Heights, Evanston, and Avondale. Then there are predominantly white neighborhoods like Indian Hill, Mount Adams, and Mariemont. Even when visiting relatives in Cleveland and Chicago, I noticed that they too had all Black neighbors when I was a child. So I grew up thinking this was normal and that this is the way it had always been. So I was dumbfounded when I learned from this book that before the late 1800s, Blacks and whites lived together in what is now the downtown area known as the Basin. Because downtown is where most people living in Cincinnati worked, near the river. Using the 1850 US manuscript census and the city directory, which can be found in the library on the second floor, the writers found that Blacks formed small residential clusters that were sandwiched in among the larger white population. Blacks clustered together for safety, mutual aid, and the desire to be close to friends, family, and other Blacks. Clusters of Blacks were always bracketed by groups of whites. If Blacks lived in the East End Factory and Central Waterfront area, they lived with Irish and German workers. If Blacks lived in the Central Core, they lived with middle-class native whites and Germans. If Blacks lived in the West End and over the Rhine, they lived with Germans. The clustering of Black institutions created a commons for Blacks during the pre-ghetto era. The Central Waterfront area, known as Little Africa, had 4 churches. The East End Factory area, known as Bucktown, had several churches, Gilmore High School, Dumas Hotel, and 2 other colored schools, the names of which were not given. Next presenter, thank you.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, a little louder.
A little louder?
A little louder.
I'm doing chapter 5, which is occupational segregation by race. And one of the things that we learn in this chapter is that Blacks began to work earlier in their lives as whites as compared to whites. And then they have to work longer in terms of their age span as opposed to whites. They're not really basically allowed to retire. They work labor jobs, barbers, and teachers. And then one thing about there were laws that were passed throughout the period of 1820 to 1860 that would help Blacks, but it primarily helped their white counterparts. You had Jim Crow South, or basically slavery. And in the North, they would come north for freedom, but they were barred from labor unions. They couldn't work basically in the industrial age of Cincinnati. And they were just basically doing slum work in our different, West End or East End or wherever they were allowed to live. They did not get a chance to go to school. There was laws passed where they couldn't get educated, as you probably would figure. But to think that even in the North, was kind of a surprise for me. And then if they did get a job, they were basically barbers, but they really thrived on the steamboat. And so once the steamboat left our region and it became more like a railroad community, or our nation moved toward the railroad as form of transportation, then that really hindered Black men, because they had many various jobs on the steamboat. And it kind of brings up what you think about Uncle Tom's Cabin and that particular book. And so that's kind of what I read in chapter 5. Thank you.
Okay, so I am back with chapter 6. City building, public policy, the rise of the industrial city, and Black ghetto slum formation in Cincinnati, 1850 to 1940, by Henry Louis Taylor Jr. So this just shows how city planning, city building, public policy, and the rise of the industrial city helped with the formation of the Black ghetto slum. Because remember, before I told you we all lived together. Blacks clustered, but they were bracketed by the white population. Well, now we're going to see the Black ghetto slum being formed due to these other issues. So I just want to lay a foundation, a little foundation. You've gotten some of it, but I just want to solidify it. Prior to 1850, the writer outlines the many things in place, put into place, that drew a solid color line between Blacks and whites in Cincinnati. Ohio's Constitution denied Blacks suffrage in 1802. This was prior to Ohio even becoming a state. That took place in 1803. The writer mentions the oppressive laws of the Ohio Black Code. That was instituted in 1804, immediately after Ohio became a state in 1803. We could not enter the state without certified proof of freedom, which had to be carried with us at all times. Once in the state, we had to post $500 in bond to guarantee good behavior. We could not vote or attend public schools, although those who owned property paid taxes. Many do not know about the bloody white riots of 1829, 1836. Dale just talked about the riot of 1841 and 1862. Much like the Tulsa, Oklahoma incident, and many of us have heard about that. Much like the Oklahoma incident, from August the 15th through August the 22nd in the year 1829, white mobs of 200 to 300 men, led by Irish immigrants, burned buildings and destroyed businesses in Black communities, in the Black businesses. City police did not intervene until the very end. More than half of Cincinnati's 2,250 African Americans headed for surrounding towns. Some family groups immigrated to Canada, where they established the Wilberforce colony. And I do have a video on that in my YouTube channel, the Wilberforce colony. 2,250 Blacks, half of them, after that riot in 1829, left the city of Cincinnati. So progressing on to 1850 with those that remained and others that came. 1850 was Cincinnati's golden age, but Blacks were confined to the lowest paying jobs. A mere 0.76%, 0.76% held factory jobs, while only 6% were clerks, shopkeepers, peddlers, traders, barbers, teachers, or businessmen. Between 1880 and 1890, an intra-urban transportation system made outward expansion possible and facilitated residential development. New neighborhoods started springing up outside the basin or the downtown area. In the 1870s, the elite middle class and higher paid workers moved to the outskirts of the city into single-family homes. Blacks moved into deteriorating multi-family dwellings. Cincinnati developers used a combination of deed restrictions and subdivision design to create neighborhoods segregated by housing type and cost. The city's idea of getting rid of the slums was to provide decent shelter for the middle class and protect residential districts from invasion of bad housing, factories, and commercial building with a comprehensive zoning system. No new housing would be built in the basin. As people moved out of the basin, their old housing would trickle down to lower income groups. Cincinnati became the first American city to adopt an official city plan in 1925 with zoning laws that, quote, codified the city's emerging class stratified residential environment and legally reinforced the economic walls separating the various residential districts, end quote. Where did this leave Black Cincinnatians? Renting in the cheapest rental housing in the ghetto slum formed in the West End of the basin. The central goal of housing reformers was to confine low-income Black workers to the basin by using building codes, zoning laws, subdivision regulations, and a comprehensive city plan. Quote, congestion, poor living conditions, inadequate healthcare delivery, low wages, and concentration of social and health problems in the basin made the Black ghetto slum a very undesirable place to live, end quote. My paternal grandparents lived in the West End from the time they moved to Cincinnati from the South, Abbeville, South Carolina, during the Great Migration. My father, aunts, and uncles were determined to get out of the West End, and most of them did. My father moved to Evanston, and from there to Glendale. 2 aunts moved from Evanston to Mount Healthy and Forest Park. Next presenter, thank you.
Hi, my name is Carol Wade, and I was born in Springfield, Ohio, and I moved to Cincinnati after college, after I was recruited from one of the larger companies here in Cincinnati, where I worked for 31 years, and I retired there. Hopefully you'll say it's early by looking at me. Thank you. Sister Melanie and I know each other because we go to the same church, and I am the chief of staff there. I am reporting on chapter 7, which is entitled Cincinnati Blacks and the Irony of Low-Income Housing Reform in 1900 through 1950. And it was written by Robert B. Fairbanks. I think that the situation that Melanie described in her chapter before was a continuation of what was happening in the 1900s. There was a quote by the Cincinnati health officer named J.H. Landis, and he lamented, quote, in Cincinnati, it's almost impossible for a colored man to secure decent quarters for his family. And he went on because he was bothered by these conditions, and he felt that Blacks are respectable, law-abiding, and industrious, but because of race prejudice, are compelled to live in the slum districts. And I wanted to set the stage, and many of the folks that have already reported have already shared these, but although Blacks were set free physically in almost 50 years earlier than this time period, they still face discrimination in many areas. For hotels, restaurants, and saloons, they were barred. Theater managers seated them in segregated quarters. Cincinnati's medical school, nor its Ohio Mechanics Institute admitted them. Most local unions closed their doors to them, and they found it difficult to get better paying jobs. Banks would not lend to Black citizens as easily as they would white citizens, and as a result, they remained on the bottom rung of the Cincinnati or the city's economic ladder. You have to understand that condition to understand the period that is going on for 1900 to 1950. But here's one thing that I wanted to share, and it was just a thought. Enslavement is both a physical and a mental state, not just for those who must be freed, but also for those that are around them. When you continue to see others being mistreated, it is easy for some to begin to justify the treatment, even though they do not execute the mistreatment themselves. It is a coping mechanism. And I say that because there were many people that saw the disparities, and there were many that did something, but there were also many that did nothing. And people have to ask themselves, why? Is it that I think that this behavior or mistreatment is justified in some way? And so I thought it was worth mentioning that, because that was one of the things that strongly stood out. The learnings that I got from this chapter is that there were a lot of attempts by the city of Cincinnati to reform low-income housing in the area because of what health officers and other folks identified, that there were poor conditions for both Black and whites in the city of Cincinnati, especially in the Basin area. As a result, there were many attempts by Cincinnati to do something about it. And as a result, Cincinnati gained national renown for its commitment to better housing through effective planning and housing leadership. Unfortunately, many of these attempts failed when it came to the betterment of housing for Black citizens in this city. There were two different philosophies that were used in the 1900s for this 50-year period for low-income housing reform. One was they wanted to improve the actual buildings or the tenements where most of the people lived. This led to, there were a lot of things that happened, but this led to tenement reform, and many of the tenement owners ended up having to pay significant monies to get their tenements up to par. And as a result, they passed those higher costs on to the folks that were living in the tenements for higher rents. When you go back to setting the stage and you understand that Black citizens were on the bottom rung of Cincinnati's economic ladder, you can see how these additional and higher rents were more difficult to pay for those who did not have the money. This led to overcrowding, because what you would find would be Black families coming together, two different families coming together, living in one house so they could afford the rents. But unfortunately, this led to a lot of sanitary issues and more impoverished living conditions. So the second philosophy that they used for improved low-income housing reform was to build or improve a neighborhood. and their focus was building, creating new established, not just improving the buildings where they lived, but also building new communities and new neighborhoods for folks to live in, because they felt that if you created a place for them to come together, like having assembly halls for religious and educational civic meetings, having playgrounds where they could play, having enhanced landscape, that would create a sense of ownership and a sense of community. But unfortunately, this led to homogeneous neighborhoods, or the need for homogeneous neighborhoods. And whites in the community protested, threatened, and rioted to prevent Black citizens from getting into housing that was built for Blacks initially. They also protested to keep Black citizens from moving into their neighborhoods like Washington Terrace, Mariemont, West College Hill, and many other neighborhoods. The notion, this is the other thing that surprised me, the notion that length of poverty impacted other moral character and deemed you as a deserving poor or an undeserving poor. If you were a deserving poor, it meant that you had not been in poverty very long, and so you had not basically been morally corrupted, which I thought, I grew up in a poor neighborhood in Springfield, where I'm from, though I did not know we were poor at the time, because we had a lot of love and we had everything that we needed. But when you look from a monetary standpoint, based on what my father and mother made and the number of children that were in our family, we were considered poor, but it had nothing to do with my moral character. And I was very surprised that they identified people as being morally corrupt if they had been impoverished for a long period of time. But the deserving poor versus the undeserving poor meant that if new benefits came into the city of Cincinnati, there was a disclaimer, and if you were poor and you were considered deserving, then you got those benefits. If you were poor and had been poor for a long time, you were undeserving, and so benefits did not come to you. If you think about the Black citizens that were in Cincinnati, they had been poor for a very long time. And so they were the ones that were primarily segregated against and denied benefits that would come from programs like Metropolitan Housing Authority and other national programs. So that was just a little disheartening. The other thing is that slums were identified not just by dilapidated buildings, but by heterogeneous neighborhoods. So if you had neighborhoods that had mixed families in those neighborhoods, you were considered to be a slum. And I thought, you know, growing up in school, this whole melting pot theory and integrated neighborhoods were the objective and the goal, and not to be considered by many in the city that they were a definition of slums. There were organizations that were established, such as the Better Housing League, who helped perpetuate the discriminatory actions against Black citizens who were just trying to better themselves by upgrading their living situations. And yet some find it hard to believe that systemic racism existed then and still exists today. So that was, I kept going back to the title of this chapter, and it says Cincinnati Blacks and the Irony of Low-Income Housing Reform. There was a need for reform for low-income housing, and yet those that were the poorest and the most identified as low income did not benefit from many of the policies and the reform efforts that were going on. That is the synopsis of my chapter.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Okay, my name is Holly Munden. I'm so sorry that I am not on camera. And those of you who have pictures up there, I tried to do that. So if you can send me some help on how to get a picture of when you're not on camera, that would be great. But my name is Holly Munden. I was born and raised in Cincinnati by two parents who family migrated up from the South and lived in the West End, and worked their way out up into Walnut Hills and Evanston, kind of as some of that migration happened. I have chapter 8, and its title is James Hathaway Robinson and the Origins of Professional Social Work in the Black Community. I asked Melanie if I could do this chapter. I know Melanie from being involved with the National Council of Negro Women. And my background is in social work. And I've worked in social work about 12 years. I now focus on mental health, disparities and counseling and things like that. But I was very interested in how social work in Cincinnati began. This chapter was written by Andrea Tuttle Kornbluh, Kornbluh. And so kind of piggybacking on chapter 6 and 7, because of what was going on with the housing and the beginning of the separation of communities and the poverty, I think this is why in the fall of 1916, the CSA, which is the Council of Social Agencies, earmarked $5,000 to have to try to set up a comprehensive plan for the Black community. And this is kind of where we've started. I think somebody always trying to have a plan for our community, and knowing best for us than we do. And so they sought out Mr. Robinson, who was a sociologist, and he was a highly educated man. He had gone to school at Fisk and Yale and Columbia, and he accepted the task to come to Cincinnati and to survey the Black migration and to work on the quote-unquote Black problem, which were the issues that faced the Black community in Cincinnati. And they were very interested because, as throughout the book and as we've mentioned in first, the city is the duality of the North and South. So those that were already here, but all that Southern influx in now having an influence on the city and how it was changing and why the Southern people were coming to Cincinnati. And the main reason that he found was that they were coming for economic reasons. And in the city at the time, it was easier to find a job, although it may not have been well paying. It was easier to find a job than decent housing. So here we go back to chapter 7, where the housing was beginning to just be a deplorable situation. And so he, after gathering this survey and finding this out, he felt like, you know, as a Black community, the community needed to organize more so internally as a group and have a voice, to be an equal, Blacks needed to be equal participants in the larger metropolitan community. Because Robinson at that time, as Mrs. Wade just said, was realizing that the Black communities, that communities were beginning to separate, and that then they were becoming pockets of Black communities, which then were having, you know, less economic success. And so he felt, though, that that was strictly due to discrimination by the broader community. So there was discrimination in the housing, in employment, and even in their entertainment venues. So you couldn't go to the movie houses, or whatever they would call it at that time. You couldn't go to certain restaurants. You couldn't go to hotels. You couldn't participate even in the pleasurable things in the city. And so the discrimination was beginning to be a factor. He also assessed that, you know, because we were separating more, that again, we needed to organize and have a campaign of education to white people about racial discrimination, and that the racial discrimination that was being levied towards Black was because of white people's ignorance of Black life, and that they needed to be taught the positive aspects of Black life and our culture. So again, it wasn't a more, you know, that moral factor of, you know, being Black or being poor, whatever was a negative, and so discrimination happened. But Mr. Robinson felt more education of white people about Blacks and truly who we were needed to be done. And so he was very, very interested in organizing the Black community, and so that they could develop their own processes. So there was a Negro Civic Welfare Committee, the NCWC, that kind of helped develop some social welfare services for the Black community. They worked to build interracial goodwill and understanding, and working on the equality and emphasizing the equal treatment of Blacks in all kind of services as a group, and to kind of work with Blacks to work as a group so that we could emphasize our desires for equal services, just wanting to have good homes, good jobs, good education, everything that goes along with it. And so because of his work, there were 11 Black social service agencies established in the city of Cincinnati, and 8 of the white social service agencies developed special, quote unquote, special departments to assist the Black community. And after the 1917 survey was done, it was thought that it would be best for social workers, that the Black community would benefit by using Black social workers in the Black community. So some of the agencies that are around that kind of morph from it, he really worked with getting, you know, the YWCA, YMCA, the Black YMCAs and Black YWCAs. The Urban League kind of came out of that, because a lot of what he found in the surveys kind of spanned and were used over the next 30 years to kind of guide the services that happened in the Black community. So some health care and welfare centers were developed because Blacks, now being centered kind of downtown in the West End, were not able to utilize those in other communities. They weren't able to be educated, or if they were doctors, you know, practice and things like that. So they had to help kind of develop those things to fit the need of the Black community and their constituents. And so I find just, you know, here we are, that was 1917, here we are in 2020, we are still, as a Black community, having to have these conversations about some of the very same things. In social work now, we are working towards some of those very same things to kind of alleviate the disparities and to educate on, you know, Blacks being not immoral, but being of equal and being entitled and not having prejudice against us. And so one of the other major factors that he had in here was talking about crime rates and the disproportionate arrests and convictions in the African American community, and where the policing was. So all of this, you know, having an impact on the Black community and unable to kind of come out of those things. So even going back to Melanie and the ADOS and that wealth disparity, you know, it's always been hard to establish. If you can't get educated, if you can't get good jobs, if you don't live in, you know, you're not going to be able to pull yourself out of those economic disparities and establish the wealth and pass that wealth on generationally wise. So I just felt that what stuck out to me as a social worker and now is that sadly we are still experiencing and trying to alleviate some of the very same issues even now. Thank you.
Just wanted to make a comment. Melanie wants me to announce that if anybody has a question, you can put it in the chat box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we're going to save the chat box. And so that way, Melanie and whoever else she designates will be able to respond to those questions for you. So just wanted to mention that. And next we'll go to Tiffany.
May I say something? Melanie, my name is Marcia Cole. I'm on the Senior Center Advisory Committee, and I'm so sorry that I have to leave. I've got to do something for my grandchildren this afternoon. But I've enjoyed this a lot, and thanks to you and all your presentation partners, I hate that I'm not going to be able to hear the whole thing, but I want to get this book. So thank you so much for being here today and doing this.
Well,
Thanks,
leave your contact information. We can connect.
Okay,
I can
great. Thank
in
you.
connection with the book.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Bye.
Uh-huh.
Oh, wait a minute. Let me find Marcia here. I thought Tiffany, I thought I had her on here. Boy, I had Tiffany lined up there. And Tiffany, are you there?
I'm here.
Somehow there you go. Good for you. Okay, thanks.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tiffany Carter. I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio, but I am currently living in Columbus, Ohio as a librarian, public librarian and branch manager. I am reading, sorry here, let me get my notes. The chapter designated to me, can you hear me well? Okay. I lost my place, technology. I'm reading chapter 9. And as you can see, I'm at work with my mask, but a lot of the historical basis has been added. So in the essence of time, I want to be a little more reactionary to this information. As someone who my chapter focused on the establishment of what they consider the second ghetto, which is the Avondale community, a community that I was born and raised in the beginning of my life. And I thought it was very interesting to learn of the barriers put in place to keep people impoverished, even as they strived to grow out of their economic circumstances. In particular, I found a document on the Cincinnati Museum website that talks, and a lot of the discussion in this essay focused on the impact of the MFRC, which is the Mayor's Friendly Relations Committee. And on this document, I'd like to read a passage. It says, the Mayor's Friendly Relations Committee, a predecessor of the Human Relations Commission, was set up by Cincinnati City Council in 1943 as a means of addressing tensions brought on by the economic and social reaction to changes during World War II. The industrial war effort resulted in a large migration to urban areas, especially from rural southern areas. The adjustments to a new way of life, both in work and in housing for the newcomers, as well as the acceptance of them by the longtime residents, led to tension, harassment, misunderstanding, and hostility. The race riots in Detroit earlier that year emphasized the danger of the situation. The MFRC was designed to help Cincinnatians through this difficult time of change. What I find interesting about that is Melanie mentioned in her, and I really enjoyed watching her read the book, but there was a chief, and his name escapes me right now, but he mentioned that he was going to document how the whites could protect their neighborhoods from the blacks. And that's a document I'd like to get my hands on to quite understand what those practices were, and if some of those practices are still in place today, considering the states of our communities. If you look at the establishment of Avondale versus the West End and the amount of middle-class people that were located in that division, I just find it really astounding that these commissions that were put in place to protect and serve were actually put in place to preserve the state of those people in those communities, regardless of their efforts to work and educate themselves out of poverty. Another concept I learned in this chapter was we often hear redlining, but we often don't talk about block busting. And for those of you that do not know what block busting is, it's a U.S. business process where real estate agents and building developers convince white property owners to sell their properties at low prices in fears that people of color are moving into their neighborhoods. So this was a very interesting chapter. It was a very interesting book to learn about the city of Cincinnati. I went to Wanna Hills High School and graduated in 2003. And a lot of these figures and all of this history were things that weren't discussed in any of our history classes. So I appreciate being a part of this discussion and learning from all the presentations before me.
Okay, thank you so much, Tiffany and Carol and Dale and all of you, all of the presenters. Thank you for taking time out of your day to listen. And if you want to just put that, Les, if you want to put up the sheet about the book club, we would like to invite you to join a book club or start a book club. Of course, it would be housed online as is everything else. Now that's Laurie's.
Okay.
She has a lot of links. If anybody is interested in getting that Laurie created, just links to all kinds of information.
I'll put it in the chat box. Yeah.
Okay, he's going to put that in the chat. And you can download that if you've got that skill, if you know how to do it. It's in where it says file, and then you would download it, and then it will load itself on your device. Okay?
All right, so I need to find the book club one here. Let's see.
Yeah, the book club one.
All right, yeah, I know I had it at some point.
That's okay. I'm just extending the invitation if anyone's interested. Any questions that you have, if you're interested in having a book club, we'd love to get one started. We're looking at possibly needing once a week, one chapter a week. This can be found on Freedom.
I'm getting it, Melanie. It's coming.
Okay.
Just,
It's just Laurie is saying something.
I was just referring to the document.
Found on the website,
Yeah.
Freedom Center website, along with much more. What Laurie has
That paper with all the links.
Yes, the paper with all the links. It can be found on the Freedom Center, Underground Railroad Freedom Center website. Thank you so much, Laurie, for making that available to us. So book club, you can find the book on Amazon, but you're going to pay a pretty penny for it. I guess I and others before you have gotten all the used ones. So all I saw available was like for $81 because like I said, it's an academic work. I'm sure it was used in classrooms. But you can listen to me read the book on my YouTube channel. So if you're interested in doing that and forming a book club, going chapter by chapter through the book in small group Zoom discussion groups, for the next several months, we want to take it slow. We want to take it nice and slow and really pick through it. Then please contact me or Claire. You can reach out to Claire at 474-3100, and my telephone number is there as well. And I guess if you want to put that down in the chat as well.
Okay.
So,
I'll do it. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. Let me look at some of these.
Thanks, Melanie.
Oh, absolutely. So glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah. We had the Mercantile Library on, and she suggested a book, but I just started. Can you see this? No? Yes?
No, it's the screen's on me.
It's called Rising Out of Hatred, The Awakening of a Former White Nationalist.
Oh. What is it again?
Oh,
Rising.
Claire, I didn't realize you were showing it on screen. Let me spotlight you here. Okay.
There it is. Rising Out of Hatred.
It was recommended by the Mercantile Library, and it is about a young man who grew up as the grandson of one of the Grand Wizards, and his life and getting out of hatred. And so far, I'm just a little bit into it, but it is very interesting and very eye-opening. So I look forward to more discussions like this, and I really appreciate everyone's time and all the members of the Senior Center who joined in. And if anyone needs to contact me for further information that you might have missed right now, you have my email or my phone number in the chat. So this is one of the biggest programs we've had attendance-wise. So,
Wonderful.
yeah, I'm really happy that we've had so many join in, and I'm glad you invited a lot of other people to join in as well.
Yes.
And we had 36 today.
That's our biggest.
Great.
Our biggest, yeah.
That's great.
Nice job.
Well, there's interest in the topic. That's wonderful. Well, I'm not going to hold everybody any longer. I'm good. I'm good.
I'll stop the recording now, and then I'll save the chat box and get that to you later, Melanie.
Thank you so much, Les. Thank you so much for
Thank
your
you,
work.
everybody. Yep.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Les.
Appreciate it.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.